Hello, welcome back to another video. This week, I completed a mixed media study with 6 professional grade watercolors, continued to test the Derwent Drawing Color Pencils, and stretch my color mixing muscles. The supplies I used include Arch's hot press 100% cotton watercolor paper, Faber-Castell's 12 pencil Polychromos set, a Derwent pencil extender, a Tombow mono ultra fine eraser, a Mars Lumograph HB pencil, the Earth Red 6 pencil set of Derwent Drawing Pencils, a white POSCA acrylic paint pen, and the Daniel Smith Watercolor Essentials set. Let's start by swatching out the Daniel Smith colors. If you want to skip straight to the study process, I've left a list of relevant timestamps in the description below. These swatches are all done on Arch's hot press paper, and this is my first time using professional grade watercolors. My first test involved creating gradients on the paper using each of the 6 included colors. These colors were vibrant and easy to work with, which isn't surprising given that these were fresh pours. Fresh paint will always be more saturated than dry pans. The 6 colors included in the set were Hansa Yellow Light, New Gamboge, Pyrrole Scarlet, Quinacridone Rose, French Ultramarine, and Phthalo Blue Green shade. Since I was going to be using pastel colors for this study, I didn't try to build the colors up to their full mass tones or darkest/brightest values, but even these diluted swatches were still more vibrant than the Cotman watercolors. Those were watercolors I used before, by the way. It was easy to soften off edges with clean water, and I was overall pleased with how they swatched. Moving into the actual study, I started by transferring my sketch onto the watercolor paper using a light box. I do this to minimize the amount of erasing I have to do on the paper. When I do erase, however, I use a tiny Tombow eraser and try to rub gently. This was a quick step this time since it was a simple composition with a profile figure. If I wasn't going to use color pencils, I would have rubbed a kneaded eraser over the lines to lighten them so that they wouldn't show through on the final painting. After taping the paper to my desk, I began laying down the background washes. You may have noticed I didn't give a review during the swatch section. I wanted to save it until I had actual experience in a study with these colors. The first thing I was hit with was their pigmentation. Daniel Smith is known for their pigmentation, and wow is this the case, at least for these 6 colors. I only needed the lightest touch in each color to cover the entire 5x7 area of this study. I found myself diluting my mixtures an almost absurd amount to reach the soft, dreamy pastels I saw in the reference photo. I also used a lot of water when painting with the Cotman watercolors, but in that case it was mostly to re-wet the really dry pans. It's a completely different experience with the Daniel Smith colors. The closest comparison I can make is the Phthalo Blue in the Cotman set. That color is the most pigmented and smoothest in the Cotman set. Every Daniel Smith color performed like the Cotman Phthalo Blue, but they were also easier to re-wet and mix. Despite what I just said about Phthalo Blue, my favorite Cotman color is actually Ultramarine, because I usually use it in nearly every mixture to shift the hue or value of a color. Because of this, I thought I would prefer Daniel Smith's French Ultramarine, but the color that stood out was actually Quinacridone Rose. Quin Rose is lighter and leans more pink than Alizarin Crimson, which was the cool red in the Cotman set. I used Quin Rose to create the pale pinks and lavenders for the sky and water surrounding the figure. It was a joy to lay these colors down and slowly build up the values. Even though there were backgrounds on my first pink layer because of my poor water control, the subsequent layer softened the blotchiness and created the dreamlike atmosphere I was aiming for. In the end, the background is more saturated than the reference photo, but I don't mind. I think it still captures the feeling I wanted, and it's still light enough to contrast against the figure. Painting the figure was still a challenge though, not because of these paints, but because of the colors and values in the reference photo. Since the photo was taken just after sunset, all the shadows are soft and diffuse. There's still definition in the forms, but it's subtle. Small details matter in these circumstances. My first attempt at the hair came out too warm and orange. After it was dry, I layered a deeper, cooler brown, which helped correct things. These browns would have been easy to mix with the Cotman set. All I would need to do was add ultramarine or phthalo blue to the burnt umber. In this study, however, I had no brown. Instead, I had to create custom mixtures using the primary colors I was afforded. It took longer than my other studies, but I found myself slowly getting better at creating the colors I wanted as I went. By the time I needed to paint the skin shadow, I was able to zero in on the color I wanted with one mix with Quin Rose, New Gamboge, and a touch of ultramarine. Once the final details were done, I sat back and assessed my progress. There are still some trouble spots like the temple and neck where the arches paper started to deteriorate, but overall I'm happy with this phase. It certainly went better than last week's study. I let the paper fully dry, then untaped it and propped it up. After that, I started cleaning things up with color pencil. The Derwent Chinese White Drawing Pencil proved invaluable in this process because it was opaque enough to cover up small flaws in the silhouette and even define the spaces between hair strands on the back of her head. My next step after that was to start adding warmth with orange, red, and yellow ochre. The precise point on the Polychromos pencils helped since I was working on a small-scale portrait. I kept most of the warmth to the very edge of the figure since this is where the warm light shone around her. One of the most satisfying parts for me was defining the lips. Shading in the upper lip gave it depth, and picking out the highlight on the lower lip hinted at the wet texture. There was still a long way to go at this point, but little victories helped keep me motivated. In the materials shot in the beginning of the video, you may have noticed a distinct lack of pastel colors. The Polychromos set contains a mixture of primary and other saturated colors, and the Derwent Drawing set has mid to deep earth tones. So how did I create the light peaches, purples, and oranges? Like watercolor, I had to mix the color pencils, but there was an additional step this time, adding white. The white Polychromos and Chinese white Derwent pencils were great at neutralizing the saturation and lightening values. So instead of worrying about how dark the color was, I would first focus on getting the right hue when mixing together the other pencils. This was how I brought warmth to the cheeks, softly sculpted the cheekbones, and smoothed out the transition on the forehead. Once I was satisfied with the face, I moved on to the hair. I didn't have enough control with a brush to paint the exact forms and curves I wanted, so I had to refine them here. I used a mixture of Derwent's chocolate and red sepia for the shadows, then cooled the highlights with the Polychromos light ultramarine and phthalo blue. The Derwent pencils created a smooth base, and the Polychromos pencils let me pick out individual details on top. Rendering the shoulders and chest involved a similar process, just with a lot more Chinese white to lighten the values. I'll let the rest of the footage play out and talk about why I chose the materials I used for the study. Why use a limited color palette for both the watercolor and color pencil stages of this study? The most practical reason I had was cost. Professional grade supplies are expensive. If I can create the same result with fewer pencils and colors, it makes sense to only get the essentials. However, that wasn't my main motivation. My main reason was I wanted to get better at color theory. I've talked about wanting to use a split primary limited palette in past studies to work towards this goal, and I figured now was as good a time as any to try that out. Like I thought, I was able to create the same array of colors and values with a limited palette, and it also forced me to learn more about color mixtures, especially those involved in earth tones. My third reason was again practical. I ran out of the ultramarine and alizarin crimson hue in my Cotman palette. I could continue using the palette without these colors, but since they represent the cool red and warm blue in the palette, it would severely limit the hues I could create. Since I needed to restock my watercolors anyway, I decided it was time to try professional grade colors. Now, having used both the Cotman Watercolor Travel Set and the Daniel Smith Essentials set, I can say with confidence that I prefer the Daniel Smith set, and that there really is a difference between student and professional grade paint. However, if I was just starting my watercolor journey, I would still choose the Cotman set. Why? It's a well-rounded mini palette that let me learn the basics of water control and traditional color mixing without stress. If you have the budget and confidence in color theory, of course, grab the Daniel Smith set, it's worth it. But if you were like me in my first studies, the Cotman set is a great introduction to watercolor as a medium. Anyway, thanks for watching if you made it this far. This is the final study. I'm happy with how it came out, even if it's still a bit more saturated than the original reference photo. I hope my first impressions of the Daniel Smith Essentials set and continued observations of the Derwent Drawing Pencils were helpful. I'm excited to use these supplies moving forward. Until then, I hope you create something that brings you joy this week. I'll see you next Friday with a new video. Bye!